I am happy to introduce our guest speakers and tell you why we are here. We are here because the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, early on, very early on, when Kinder Morgan was proposing the idea of a pipeline going through western Massachusetts and ending in Dracut, the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission found a grant opportunity through the United States Department of Transportation, a pipeline safety grant. They applied for that grant on behalf of all of the impacted regions in Massachusetts. Part of that grant is an informational workshop where we will get technical and safety information and legal information about the FERC process and other aspects of the pipeline. This is the very first workshop to be held in Massachusetts, so we'll work together and get your feedback on how it is. What we're going to do is have Jeffrey Bernstein from BCK Law start. He has about a 40-minute presentation. We'll stop after that for about 10 minutes of questions, and then we'll hear from Marco Boscardin, who is from Boscardin Consulting Engineers, and he'll talk about more specific pipeline safety issues. He'll also speak for 30 to 40 minutes, has lots of pretty pictures. We'll take time for questions, and then if there is still time, we'll just do general questions. Sound like a plan? Okay, let me first introduce Mr. Bernstein. He serves as the president and managing director of BCK Law, which is in Newton, Massachusetts, Woodstock, Vermont, and Haley, Idaho. Someday we'll find out why Haley, Idaho, along with those. Mr. Bernstein founded the firm in 1983, and his practice is focused on environmental and energy issues. He served as lead counsel to many municipalities regarding pipeline projects, including the Massachusetts towns of Richmond, North Andover, Saugus, and Sandwich, as well as Londonderry, New Hampshire, and others. Mr. Bernstein.
Thank you very much, Linda. I first got involved with gas pipelines when one was proposed in the town of Richmond nearly 30 years ago. And what the Board of Selectmen and others in town expected would be about a 3-month process ended up going many, many years, though the town eventually achieved the result they wanted. That pipeline, however, unlike this one, was subject to state procedures, and you'll see throughout my talk that you really have to understand, and hopefully you'll understand some more about how the federal process and the federal scheme works and interacts with state, local, and regional planning. So the most important thing to understand is that when a pipeline is subject to the federal siting process by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that is meant to be, for the most part, with a few exceptions, which I'll talk about, one-stop shopping. And it's an overarching siting process that in some cases like this can last years. Under the Natural Gas Act, state and local action is preempted. Preempted means that a state agency or a local board or body cannot act in a fashion that's inconsistent with FERC. That doesn't mean, however, that FERC isn't going to try to reach a result that takes into significant account the feelings of state and local bodies. However, let me give you an extreme example. If FERC grants a certificate, and we're going to go through what that means during my talk, if they grant a certificate for a pipeline and a town or a state agency says no, that is a conflict. And the state or local action would be superseded, would be preempted by the FERC certificate. So here we have one of several major new gas supply lines proposed for New England. And I'm sure most of the people here are pretty well informed. There are several different proposals, and there are also some transmission proposals proposed. And it's a likelihood that not all of them are going to get built. But this is a huge project. As you know, it's got two main sections, one from New York going to Dracut, Massachusetts, and the first segment comes from Pennsylvania and goes to Wright, New York. It's got an estimated cost, and this is a rough number at this point, in the billions of dollars. The project formally started in September of 2014. The applicant, Kinder Morgan Tennessee Gas Pipeline, elected to go through a pre-filing process, a consultation process. By a show of hands, how many of you have already had some contact, gone to another meeting, or submitted comments with the pre-filing process? Looks like the great majority of people have. As you know, there was a route change proposed, which now takes the project through New Hampshire and it crosses the state line and goes into New Hampshire far earlier than was originally proposed. My colleague, Rebecca Zakis, who helped with this presentation, has the good fortune to live in one of the towns to which the proposed pipeline was rerouted. So anyhow, what's happened, and there have been delays, and there often are delays in the process, but the consultation process is building up to a formal beginning of the process that any pipeline applicant has to follow. And we've heard that there is going to be a further delay. They haven't designated the locations for the compressor stations. I don't know, are there any compressor stations proposed okay. Northfield, okay. I'm not as familiar with the Franklin County part of the route. The Berkshire Regional Planning Commission that we've been representing for nearly a year has offered some comments, and they and others have said that the information is incomplete. FERC seems to be agreeing with that, and before the formal part of the application process starts, Kinder Morgan is going to have to designate the compressor station locations. And there'll be another draft. These are the main acronyms. You probably have heard most of these terms. Environmental assessment, environmental impact statement, environmental report, they're all variants of the study of the environmental land use impacts of a project. The Endangered Species Act, which is something that has to be paid attention to and is implicated as this proposal crosses Massachusetts. FERC, of course, the acronym. NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, that is not a permitting process. That is a planning process. And a federal agency is designated as the lead, in this case it's FERC, to go through the NEPA process. We're going to talk more about that. The Natural Gas Act, which is where FERC derives its primary authority. And finally, the Notice of Intent that starts the scoping process formally. So we've been in pre-filing for a while where the FERC staff works with the applicant. That process takes a minimum of 6 months. It's taken longer here. Once FERC starts its formal review, there is no specific timeline, but the average is about 12 months. Complex, very controversial projects can take years. After FERC issues its order, you can ask for rehearing by the agency, and then you can go to court. Court challenges are usually focused on specific legal issues. Very, very, very rarely does a court substitute its technical judgment for the technical findings that FERC has made and that come out of the environmental review process. So when and where can a town participate? It seems like a lot of you have already had some contact, and towns can, there have been open houses. You can contact FERC or the project sponsor. You can offer comments. Once the application process begins, a town or individuals can formally seek to intervene. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but that puts you on the service list so you get access to all the filings in the docket. This is now done electronically, As I think most people in the room know, the filings already are voluminous. So if you actually got paper, you'd probably need to move out of your house or your town offices. There will be FERC-led scoping meetings throughout Massachusetts along the pipeline route, and FERC will take comments. Again, we'll talk about what's involved, but FERC will receive comments. FERC will receive suggested conditions. Basically, prior to that notice of intent is the time to do your homework if you're concerned about the pipeline's specific impacts in your community. Additionally, there will be other permitting proceedings, which for the most part are integrated with the FERC process. And some towns, and we've represented many communities, have chosen to enter into host community agreements or community benefit agreements. And those are agreements that spell out some of the environmental conditions, some of the construction conditions. They spell out terms. And contrary to what people sometimes think, some communities choose to enter into these agreements without necessarily taking a position for or against a project. But they take the view, some of the communities we've represented, that if the project comes, they certainly want to try as hard as they can to sensitize an applicant to what's going to happen. And a recent example that I can give you, which is not a pipeline example, but it's a Massachusetts example, is we represented some communities on Cape Cod that would have been the host to a huge new underground electric transmission line had the wind farm off the Cape been built. I guess the project's not officially dead, but it's certainly run into a lot of problems. And these were towns that wanted to participate in the process, but to make sure that if there was a new significant underground energy facility, that the construction process, the economic terms, some of the things Marco's going to talk about later when he talks about the impacts of construction and operation of a pipeline. In this case, this was, again, it was an electric transmission line. It was different, but the town spent some time negotiating a host community agreement or a community benefit agreement. There's two basic kinds of preemption. It's a legal doctrine, and it's basically that a higher power supersedes action by agencies or government entities at a different level of government. One kind is called sharp conflict, and that's not what we have here, which is much narrower, where a federal law says to the states and the towns, you can't do anything on this specific topic. Or the state says to towns, you can't do anything on this very limited topic. We have here, and there's lots and lots of case law, what's called occupying the field preemption. And Congress first made the judgment back in the 1930s that the siting and operation of interstate lines was so important that they wanted to delegate all of that to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And there are several major federal statutes. The main one is the Natural Gas Act. And as I said, the courts have found that what Congress intended, and it's clear language, is with a few exceptions, no state agency, regional agency, town can take actions under its own permitting process that conflict with FERC's action. FERC does make an effort, and in recent years has made more of an effort to try to harmonize its decision-making with what it hears from state agencies and what it hears from localities. The Massachusetts Energy Facility Siting Board, which regulates state proposals to build pipelines and transmission lines and energy facilities, will intervene before FERC, and they will try to be an advocate as they see it on a statewide basis. And many communities may intervene, regional entities, and of course individuals. It is not, the FERC process is not a trial type proceedings. So there are not witnesses testifying under oath. You don't need lawyers to participate. It doesn't have some of the same kinds of bars that other regulatory proceedings at the federal level have. Congress specifically carved out 3 federal programs in which some of the permitting and action is done at the state level. Section 401, it's under the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, and water quality certificates, in which some of the permitting goes on by, in our case, the DEP. The Coastal Zone Management Act, which is obviously not something that is going to have any impact here, and the Clean Air Act for projects that have air quality impacts. As I said before, FERC really encourages cooperation between the pipelines and local authorities. The siting board will intervene to try to preserve the rights of interested citizens, so they're, in a sense, an advocate. The Attorney General, I would expect to intervene. I don't know what level of resources the Attorney General's office will bring to this pipeline. The State Department of Energy Resources will likely intervene. I don't know, and some of you may know better than I, what our new governor's position is on this pipeline. They can intervene on permitting issues. They can also intervene on the need for the pipeline. We'll get to that. Notwithstanding what I've said, state agencies and local permitting authorities that have control over one or more aspects can issue and do issue permits and conditions that are generally consistent with the approval, and that means that you can sometimes go farther. You can impose additional construction, and Marco, I think, will talk about some of these kinds of issues from a on-the-ground technical perspective. But FERC will try to, as I said, to harmonize its decision and to incorporate that. The standard, which is the last line of this slide, is that the state and local action cannot prohibit or unreasonably delay the construction and operation of the pipeline facility. So if a locality is trying to prevent construction of the pipeline and imposes a series of conditions that are viewed as so difficult, so onerous, where the real intent is not to get the pipeline proponent to abide by those conditions, but to try to prevent it altogether, those are the kinds of things that FERC will override, or the pipeline proponent can go to court and waive its FERC certificate and said, look, the town of X has 500 construction conditions. They say they're all necessary, but they go too far. The other types of permits that are likely to be necessary in your case are road opening permits, erosion and sedimentation control, lots of wetlands issues. Those are very important issues for pipelines. When pipelines cross roadways, when they cross rivers or other water bodies, and some of that does implicate one of the 3 areas which I told you a few minutes ago is carved out under the Water Pollution Control Act. And so in some cases, routes are changed, or even though a pipeline has FERC approval, it may not get a 401 or other water-related approval, and the route needs to be changed. Article 97, a big issue in Massachusetts. The pipelines are required to obtain Article 97 approvals. I am not sure what the answer is as to what happens if a pipeline needs to cross parkland or other land that's preserved under Article 97 and ultimately can't get approval. I can tell you that in one case that we were involved, we had just such a problem, and we were in federal court litigating the issue of whether there was a carve-out here, and we ultimately didn't get an answer because there was a settlement between the town that we represented and the pipeline proponent that ultimately avoided the Article 97 land. So I don't know what the answer is to that, but I'm sure there are a lot of Article 97 issues, and there will be attempts to mitigate Article 97 crossings. The Secretary of Environmental Affairs, of course, is involved, Secretary Beaton, and you need 2/3 votes of whatever local body has custody or control, as well as a 2/3 vote of the General Court. And I'm sure a lot of you, if you've dealt with the legislature, know it's hard to get 2/3 of the House and Senate to agree on anything. The pre-filing process, which is mostly complete, I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly because it's what's already happened. It's voluntary. Kinder Morgan elected to do it to try to identify issues. There have been open houses, which I believe are concluded now. FERC staff attempts to work collaboratively with the pipeline proponent, and they're trying to determine the scope of what type of environmental review they're going to have. The application has a non-environmental review part to it to make sure that the project's financially viable, that there's some need for it, and the need standards have changed quite a bit over time. FERC used to spend a lot of time looking to make sure that there were subscriptions from users who wanted to contract for transportation from the wellhead or from a gas supply site along the pipeline for 100%. They no longer do it that way. They use more of a balancing approach, but it certainly is a consideration to look at the market. They look at the impact of the route on landowners and communities, not just from an environmental perspective, but from an economic perspective, from the perspective of sensitive receptors and just where it's sited. Marco's going to talk more about that. And they look at the tariff, because there has to be a FERC-approved tariff as to how much it's going to cost to transport gas along this new line. The main concern and the main place that most communities choose to get involved is under the environmental review and under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. And there are 3 levels of findings. There's significant, and there, if FERC finds that, they prepare a full-scale environmental impact statement, much more extensive document. If it's less than significant, you see an environmental assessment. If they find that there's no significant impact, they have what they call, all these acronyms, a FONSI, not from Happy Days, but finding of no significant impact. So for a complex project, like this one, you typically would expect to see either an environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment. I frankly would be surprised if this applicant even made any noise about a finding of no significant impact. I would expect that they would concede that there are significant impacts, but that they have properly mitigated them or can properly mitigate them, and comparing it to alternatives, which we'll come to. So here's the standard of review. The legal term is public convenience and necessity. Can it stand on its own without having existing gas transportation customers provide some subsidies? And do the overall public benefits outweigh the adverse impacts? And this slide lists out the type of things in very broad language. There are lots and lots of cases, and we can provide, and if it's useful, you can find them in FERC's electronic file room, but we can provide some links to some sample certificates if you're interested in looking at them, and you can look at some of these decisions and see how FERC balances it. And they will look at cumulative impacts. As I mentioned, this is but one of several major proposals to bring new energy supply into New England. Gas supply, or in some cases the electric utilities, have proposed building huge new transmission lines coming down from Canada to try to mitigate the impact of shortages in terms of either gas supply or electricity in winter, in peak periods. You probably all saw on your electric bills how your generation portion of your bill was extremely expensive during the winter period. It's coming down, or has come down, in most areas in Massachusetts. But the sort of 30,000-foot view is we don't have adequate gas transportation In winter months, natural gas has become the fuel of choice in New England, at least for a while, and that's a big part of Kinder Morgan's justification for the project. The pipeline proponent goes out and attempts to negotiate right-of-way agreements with landowners and public landowners. At the end of the day, and I'm sure everybody in this room knows it, if you have a FERC certificate, you can also exercise a right of eminent domain, which means if a landowner refuses to enter into a right-of-way agreement, you can compel that, and if you can't come to an agreement about what the valuation is, there's a process to get it valued, which sometimes involves going to court. I will tell you that pipeline companies really don't want to do it. It adds significant delay to the process. And so it varies some, but they all do try to avoid using that eminent domain authority. But at the end of the day, that's a sword they have in their arsenal. The NEPA review, as I said, FERC becomes the lead agency for the purpose of carrying out the National Environmental Policy Planning Act dictates. They have to not only look at the pipeline, they have to look at reasonable alternatives. They go and they look for comments from other federal agencies as well as state, regional, and local agencies, and they consider a whole range of environmental impacts. I'm not going to read them all. And they also look at the cumulative impact of other pipeline proposals. So they don't just take one segment or one proposal completely out of context if there are other proposals that are also pending at the same time. The next two slides run through the process, and you'll see there's several different paths depending on whether there's an EIS or an environmental assessment. The environmental assessment process is much faster and has fewer steps to it and fewer comment periods. And then at the very bottom, what happens if it's approved and what happens if it's denied. I think probably most people know, but there are very few certificate applications that are denied. Some of them are withdrawn or changed, but there are very few cases in which a pipeline proponent goes all the way through the process and finds that their application is denied. FERC can place certain conditions on the order, and sometimes they'll incorporate public conditions, and I know of circumstances in which those conditions could not be satisfied, so that projects that actually got certificates didn't end up being built or being built as they were originally certified. So now we're at eminent domain, another section of the Natural Gas Act. I think I've already talked about this one. So now I'm to what we call a community benefits agreement or host community agreement. And we've represented towns and nonprofits who've had concerns about proposals, and some pipeline companies have viewed it as a real positive to negotiate these, even understanding that under Massachusetts law, the fact that there's a host community agreement or community benefits agreement with a pipeline company doesn't mean the town supports the project, and in fact, a town cannot agree in advance to give a permit. Massachusetts law doesn't allow that. A town could agree that they will conduct permitting in an expeditious fashion, but you can't say to an applicant, in exchange for a community benefits agreement, you don't have to go through under our wetlands bylaw, or you don't need another approval. But keep in mind, by the way, and in some cases there may be zoning issues, but keep in mind that a denial is something that's going to be preempted if FERC gives the certificate. So the benefit of a community benefits agreement, if you choose to talk about that, is that it's another way of identifying issues and providing some guardrails, and FERC will incorporate those into its decision most of the time if it views it as reasonable. I've never run into a circumstance where they thought something that a town and an applicant asked for was unreasonable. I suppose it's possible. So strategic options. town, and I'm going to focus on towns. You can participate alone, as groups, through another entity. The Berkshire Regional Planning Commission has gathered together a group of towns in Berkshire County and in eastern New York that will collectively participate in the FERC process with respect to the Northeast Direct project. Variety of objectives to avoid impacts, to look for route changes, to minimize impacts, to mitigate impacts economically as well as environmentally. Some towns have tried to build a process to hear from residents and to advocate on behalf of residents. For instance, some years ago, one of the towns we represented looked at a pipeline company and said, we want you to provide the same form of easement to every landowner. We don't want you dividing and conquering. We want a lot of monitoring, mitigation. We want a clerk of the works so that if there are problems with construction, that we have a whole process to address those kinds of things. Another reason to do it, obviously, is that individual towns, particularly smaller communities, as well as others, may not be able to participate as effectively, and it's a complicated process. And you all are here to educate yourselves and care about this process, but as I said, I mean, you could make a full-time job just looking at all the paper, or it won't be paper if you but electronic filings that are going to happen once the application process starts moving in the fall. I could take a few questions now if you have some questions. Yes, sir.
The community benefit agreements, is there a point in the process where it is less likely that Kinder Morgan or whichever company is going to do the project is going to be willing to do that?
I'll try to give a general answer, and it varies from company to company, because some companies have learned the hard way that it's better to try to build as much support as they can and are much more open than others. But generally, earlier in the process is better. But sometimes early in the process, you don't know what all the impacts are. So you might have a two-step process where you ask for some technical resources so that you can, and your town is specifically concerned about some wetlands or some roadland crossings and that kind of thing. So you can't complete it. But earlier is generally better, and certainly once that scoping process happens, which we're told will be this fall, it's a 30-day, you better line up as many ducks as you can. So my general advice is, you don't want to do it so early in the process that you don't have any idea of what the impacts are, and the route, a lot of towns have been frustrated because they haven't seen specific routes. You still don't know in the case of the compressor stations, but we're beginning to be at that point. On the other hand, if the pipeline proponent is still willing to talk to you and the final FERC order hasn't issued, you can still try to do it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir?
So my name is Jeff Singleton. I'm on the Montague Energy Committee. I wanted to see that slide, if you could show it, where the final criteria that FERC uses to make the decision, pluses and minuses. Public benefits, yeah, that's it. Adverse impacts all seem to involve, I don't see anything there about whether it's good energy policy.
There will be arguments about energy policy. I mean, and I'm here tonight to educate as opposed to advocate. As lawyers, we sometimes are advocates, and we will undoubtedly be advocates for whichever communities we end up representing in this process. And there is a place to talk about energy policy. And there are state statutes like the Global Warming Solutions Act, which, while they don't govern here because of preemption, they certainly are something FERC will look at. And I have no doubt people will make arguments about where this pipeline and where it fits in overall energy policy.
So the second question I had is that when I came in here, I was under the impression that one of the primary criteria is whether they have enough contracts to fill the thing. In this case, and you're saying they've sort of moderated that a bit.
Yes.
Could you explain a little more on that?
Yeah, I mean, the process used to require as extreme as 100% subscription, and now they look at a balancing test. So the fact that you don't have 100% of your transportation capacity subscribed is not necessarily fatal if you can show other things. And this begins to be an energy policy question. And part of it is the theory is in a merchant market, you know, they're undertaking this with their own capital. I mean, you have to show that you're not a fly-by-nighter when you talk about, you know, a multi-billion-dollar project. But there are a number of different criteria that will be looked at here. And as I said, I think early on, we've got several major projects proposed, major pipelines and major electric transmission lines proposed in New England. And the market probably won't support all of them. And I doubt all of them are going to get approved and make it through the process.
Jed Prujansky, selectman from Northfield. Two quick questions. The first is on Article 97. If the legislature does not vote to give up the protected lands, is that final in terms of that land, meaning that the pipeline would have to, if they desired, route around all of that land?
I don't know the answer to that because I don't think it's ever been litigated. And in the sense, and I had a case that raised those issues but was settled. So if you can't get the Article 97 approvals and the pipeline has its certificate and says, we trump that, we preempt that, at the end of the day, I don't know what a federal court is. I wouldn't bet on the outcome of that, but I wouldn't bet that a federal court is going to choose Article 97 under the Massachusetts Constitution over this very broad federal statute, but I don't know.
And the other quick question, in our town we had a ballot and 85% of the voters were opposed to the pipeline. Does that have any impact in and of itself, and is there a way you would suggest we could use that rather than the voice of 3 selectmen, for example?
Well, I'm sure FERC will take note of how people, how people feel about that. But FERC's had controversial proposals before where the majority of affected residents didn't support it and they've approved it. So I wouldn't attempt to predict what that one factor how they would assess that one factor.
I'm Cheryl Dukes. I'm Buckland's selectman. Buckland doesn't have the pipeline going through its community, and yet we're surrounded by communities with pipeline issues. And I'm just wondering, in terms of all of this, how do abutting communities, how are they affected and how are they able to weigh in on some of these things? Because you can't get there without going through here.
This is not like standing in a zoning case, for those of you familiar with that, where you have to show a harm, you have to show a potential injury. So the fact that your town is not necessarily got the line routed through it, if I understand the question, doesn't preclude you from participating in the process and expressing concerns about impacts. How do we do that, though? Well, you do that by intervening if you chose to do it. You don't have any permits or approvals, so you're less likely to have any grounds to really seek a community benefits agreement, but you certainly can participate, offer comments, and if a group of towns participate together or through a regional entity, you've got a voice that way as well. I think I'm going to turn it over to Marco.
Okay, my name is Marco Boscardine. I'm an underground engineer, for lack of better words. I deal with geotechnical and structural issues related to underground tunnels, pipelines, those sorts of things. I used to teach at University of Massachusetts and University of Illinois. And then in about 1980, 88, 89, I entered into the consulting business, and then in 2003, I started my own firm right down in Amherst. And I understand a little bit what you're going through as town representatives. I'm on the Board of Health in Amherst, and we deal with contentious issues as we deal with things along the way. Okay, today what I'm going to try to talk about is the design and construction of pipeline. I'm going to go over, even though I've got lots of words written down on some slides, I'm going to gloss over the high points of them. Quick outline, brief introduction. Then I want to look at some typical design considerations for gas pipelines, typical construction methods, look at landowners, local area concerns, potential impacts, and then closing questions. Look a little bit about where we are. Geology-wise, we're coming through the mountains in here. We're coming through right where we are, the Connecticut River Valley. And so we're going from uplands to the lowlands. If you start looking at some of the characteristics, that alone creates some interesting issues related to pipeline design and construction. We're going to have to go through rocks. We're going to have to go through some soft clays and the varf clays in the valley here. We're going to have to go under a number of rivers. And then you've got all the high upland marshes and such that we have to look at. Potential conditions along a pipeline route going through, particularly western Massachusetts. We're going to have areas, we're going to have clays, glacial till, shallow rock, and slopes. All have major implications regarding alignment selection. Thrown on top of that, we've got streams and wetlands. And then we've got across roads, railroads, that have their own special set of characteristics. We've got conservation lands, agricultural lands, and one of the things in the western part of the state here that you don't see in some of the other states where they have major pipelines going through them is that our agricultural lands are not just grazing lands or crop lands. We have agricultural lands that are woodlands or orchards and things like that that have certain special needs. We've got cultural resources ranging from historic areas, cemeteries, to possibly Native American areas that need to be preserved archaeological significance. And then we have cities, towns, and rural residents. When you start looking at alignment selection, how does the pipeline company want to come about this? We can be really cynical and say they want the straightest, cheapest way of getting there. That's true to a certain extent. They also are interested in safety and long-term life of their line, because this is not an insignificant investment. And if this line goes down for any reason, it's money lost down the road. So they have a vested interest also in trying to make something within what they think their reason is of what is safe. When we look at safety, things that come up right away are explosions, get notoriety. Turns out most of the explosions we often hear about are older distribution lines, not the main lines as much as the distribution lines, and they're older cast iron and segments. Or the other thing that happens is everybody must be familiar with like DigSafe and things, one-call systems that you call before you dig, that we have people that go out and willy-nilly excavate down, and these lines aren't very deep, hit them, rupture them, and scrape along some rocks and cause a problem. The other thing is people are concerned about toxicity related with the leaking of methane. One of the things to keep in mind is it's really not toxicity per se, it's asphyxiation. Methane, the biggest component of natural gas is methane, which in its way is very different from propane. Propane's a different animal in terms of what it's made up of. But it's things that come out of swamps, comes out of our farms, and things like that. And so when you get in concentrations that are enough, they can asphyxiate you. And that's kind of the main issue. The other thing that happens with kind of leaks with natural gas, that we try to take advantage of in design is that it's lighter than air. Therefore, if something leaks out a little bit, its tendency is to rise up and dissipate. So what we want to do is we want to avoid trapping it in places where it can accumulate. Because once you get accumulation in the range of 5% to 15% methane in air, that's the explosive range. If it's less than that, it doesn't explode, and if it's more than that, it can't ignite. If you look at things, one of the things that when you look at safety plans, they often have they take the lower explosive limit, that like 5% number, and they don't want anything within 10, they only want a number that's no more than 10% of that lower explosive limit is what, when they start looking at accumulations in areas where they work. When I deal with tunneling projects and we have concerns about hitting methane, we look at things not at 5%, but 0.5% is when we get really concerned about it's going to have an impact on safety of the workers. If we look at impacts on the surrounding land and use facilities, we want to look at future use of right-of-ways. This is very different than most right-of-ways that people think about that you use for paths and things like that. You're going to be limited on what you can build on it. You're going to be limited, perhaps, on what you can plant on it. They're going to want to come through periodically and be able to either mow or put herbicides on it so they can keep access, because they have to do relatively frequent periodic inspections in this area. The other thing that could happen in restored land is, do they put things back the way it was? Anytime, if you've ever done anything where you've excavated something and then tried to put the earth back in place, even if you've been careful about segregating things, it's never quite as good as it was before for a number of years until you amend it. So if you have something that was a prime farmland for crops and things like that, you excavate out something, it's probably going to be a little less fertile for a while after it's restored. And how much less fertile will depend a lot on how good they were on segregating the soils and putting them back, and what you had there before. Because when you start looking at the plans, all the plans talk about putting back 12 inches of topsoil. But if you had 18 inches of topsoil before, and only putting back 12, it could have an impact. So those are kinds of things to consider. A really important area in terms of pipelines and their construction, that's probably in some ways the most impacts, at least on the surface to people, is when they're doing the cutting and they're controlling erosion during that. You have runoff. You've got now not a small 1 or 2 acre plot that somebody might do if they're doing, a fairly major building or something, but you've got a long corridor 100 foot wide that is going to be open, denuded, and when the rain hits it, how do we control any runoff from that to prevent a problem? Also, that's during the construction is when you usually get your most noise for most parts, except for things like compressor plants. When you get your most dust, vibration because they're excavating, placing materials, compacting, perhaps blasting, or otherwise cutting rock that has some vibration impacts. And then during construction, you've got this big machinery with hydraulic hoses and things. They're filling up with diesel fuels, and that's where you actually get your most issues with spills. Again, keep in mind, if you have a leak from a pipeline itself, it's going to rise up as a gas and dissipate, so you don't usually get a lingering effect in the soil. But during the construction, if hydraulic fluid gets dropped or diesel fuel gets dropped, it's something that you have to clean up because that has more of an impact on in migrating off the property into nearby areas. And the last thing I want to look at is crossing sensitive lands. That's where things get kind of innovative in terms of construction, across either wetlands, rivers, areas that are maybe even culturally sensitive. One of the concepts is to go under it by using trenchless methods, where you don't excavate from the surface down, but you start off at one end and basically drill a big hole, pull a pipe through it, and in theory, don't do anything to impact the wetlands or the sensitive lands. So the first thing with gas lines is most of what we see around with gas lines that are put in the area are distribution lines. There's not that many transmission lines. Transmission lines are the main trunk lines. They have very few taps on them to pull off gas. They tend to be high pressure, and pretty much they're going to tend to be steel because of the pressures. When you get into distribution lines, the older ones are various metals and cast iron. The newer ones tend to be polyethylene that tend to be a little more resistant to corrosion, a little bit more resistant to bending. If we look at the transmission line typical sizes, 24 to 40 inch in diameter, they're talking about a 36-inch diameter pipe here, and pressures can go up to 1,500 psi, and that's quite a lot. But keep in mind that you double the diameter of the pipeline, you got 4 times the area, plus you've got less surface area to cross-sectional area, so you got less friction. And then if you up the pressure, you can also transmit a lot more gas. Now, one of the interesting things with the pressure in gas pipelines is they, and we'll discuss a little bit more in a couple later slides, they look at what the population density is around the pipeline on a per mile basis, and what they do is they allow you to, well, they tell the designer that you can only use this much of the strength of the pipeline. And one of the interesting things that happens is that as populations in areas change, you can have the pressure capacity of your pipeline downrated. So that's one thing where owners have to look at, and I mean the pipeline owners have to look at and say, okay, what am I going to assume? Because if my pipeline is downrated, originally it was something that they said we could carry 1,500 psi throughout the whole length of the pipeline, but now I've got to downrate segments of it. It's cutting back on my capacity, and it's not something you're going to go in and replace that section of pipe with heavier pipe. That's just too expensive. So people have to also think about and forecast what the likely population growth is and whether they want to invest in thicker walled pipe in those areas. Look at design life, and everybody, anytime you look at design life, anything like public infrastructure, you always have to laugh. You know, numbers are 50 to 75 years, and you say, well, this thing's been here for 100 years. We got a lot of pipelines around that have been around for 50 plus years. So although this is the kind of what everybody talks about, the design life, we know it's going to be there for a long time. So what that means is there's going to be a lot of focus ultimately put on inspection of that pipeline and operations and maintenance to keep it going safe. And at what point do you have to replace things? And that's one of the other things that you come down is to replace pipes. Do you need to have enough capacity in one part of the system that you've got redundancy, that you can take parts of the pipeline at a surface or part of one and rely on another one to create redundancy to keep your supply going rather than have something totally go out. We also have to look at loads, soil, water, thermal stresses. A lot of times crossing rivers and things like that, people say, why don't we use the bridge? Or sometimes crossing major highways. Oh, there's 2 things. One is the highway agencies don't like you putting things on there because hanging things off their bridge is another maintenance nightmare for them. But it's also something that's out in the open, and something buried in the ground, its temperature range of variation isn't nearly as much as something above the ground, so you get a lot more stresses with heating and cooling of the pipe and elongation and shortening. And it's also, on things like bridges, you're more open to damage due to random impacts. You know, something buried in the ground, if it's marked and people are doing what they're supposed to, it's much less likely to get hit and harmed by something. Last thing I'd put on a couple things is seismic. Yes, we have small tremors and grounds, but here in the in the east, but we don't usually have anything that creates a significant shear offset. And pipelines, by and large, do rather well in ground shaking. But ground stability is another thing. If you're crossing a slope that's rather steep, and that ground is unstable and wants to slide, measures have to be taken in design to stabilize it. And then the final thing is what kind of access constraints to get on the corridor. The ground, you got environmental, cultural considerations, corrosion. This is kind of the big thing, because when we talk about design life of things, what's the major effect going to be on them? It's going to be how much corrosion and how fast corrosion goes. And today they've gotten much better at dealing with corrosion. There's a couple of ways of dealing with it. One way is to put a thicker section of pipe so that before you get down to the minimum section that you need for stability, it still performs adequately. The better way, and the way that most of the regulations go, is you've got to put a coating on the pipe. And today, a lot of the major lines are not only being coated on the outside to protect the steel, but they're being coated on the inside to protect the material. And then the last thing is that they often try to site things away from major sources of electricity. That's why it's less common to find metal pipes, steel pipes, near high tension lines and things like that, because the stray currents in the ground promote corrosion. Abrasion is something, is plows going to hit it in an agricultural area, and how nice are they about putting the pipe in, or gentle about putting the pipe in becomes an area. Important thing is the location class. This is out of the Federal Register, and it says if you have 10 houses or less, you're in class 1, and you can use 72% of the safe yield of the pipe steel. As we get in higher areas, you can see in the class 4, more density, we can only use 40%. So there's quite a drop in there. That means for the pipeline to carry the same amount through a class 1 and a class 4 area, the class 4 area pipe has to be thicker. The other thing that this tells you, and this class thing goes, it looks like at a corridor. Technically, it says 660 feet on either side of the pipeline. They count up the houses per mile. And they have different ways of doing overlapping miles and things like that, so that they can't skew it one way or the other. And to come up with this class. It turns out that for the higher pressure pipeline, because it's high pressure and it's large diameter, we're going to have a potential impact area of about 930 feet, if the numbers that I've read this pipeline are correct, that they use to calculate these classes. And also in terms of classes, it's not just how many houses there are there, but they'll look at beaches, parks that have a certain high occupancy for a certain number of days a year. So they go to areas where, and look at this, and they take safety quite important in terms of the regulations. And then the last kind of things I want to talk about in designs are quality assurance and quality control. In design of pipelines, or most any construction, this is truly important. For example, all these coatings that people talk about putting them on, if these people are rough with the materials, dropping it, scraping it along, they end up scratching away the coating and create corrosion points. So that's a really important thing. So how you install the pipe, what kind of materials you put around the pipe. Sometimes if you have no choice but to use really coarse angular material, you may actually put a buffer wrapping over the coating to keep things safe. Other important things are the inspections. not only do you do inspections during construction, but there's got to be periodic inspections, and particularly the newer pipelines, they go along with what are called smart pigs. They run these instrumented carriers down the pipe that will measure things like the radius and diameter of the pipe, and if there's any changes in that, any thickness of the pipe changes ultrasonically, and they'll even take samples along the way to see if there's any liquids in the bottoms of pipes and things like that could be corrosive liquids. And then during the construction, there's lots of testing that's done. You don't get your backyard welder out to do this. You have to have certified welders. The certified welders are not, you don't just get a certified welder. He's got to be certified to weld a certain type and thickness of pipe and in certain positions. There may be people that are certified to weld just from above in the first couple of passes, but the guy that has to work underneath and do things from the bottom up has to pass a different certification, and they're very strict on that. And then when they look at the pipes, after they connect them and weld them, they do X-rays to check them. In certain areas, they'll be checking 10% of the welds, but something like each welder has to get one of his welds checked each day. And in other areas that are like the class 4 areas, they may go through and require X-rays and checking of all the welds. Then during operation maintenance, they go along the corridors and they will have sniffers go along to detect emissions of the gas, and they also check at their metering stations how much gas has come in and gone out. Interestingly enough, gas is a tough material to deal with because as you change pressures and things like that, you have to account for that, and it's not the simplest thing in the world to do. But they try to keep track of it because any gas loss is money lost to the people. And the other part is risk. We've got, as town folks in the area, we're worried about the risk to our environment and to our health and safety. The gas company is also looking at monetary risk, and to that end, they go to some great lengths that, even though they might be fairly mercenary about it, their ultimate interests tend to be similar to ours in terms of safety and things like that, because something that's safe is also something that reduces their monetary risk. Pipeline construction methods. The conventional way is you cut a trench, put the pipe in it, backfill it, and go. Cut and cover. You may do it with a backhoe. You may do it with trenching machines, depending on the materials. You look at this, the right-of-ways are quite wide, 85 to 100 feet, and the permanent right-of-way in easements is about 50 feet with your pipeline in the middle. So that means that the right-of-way to where somebody has use of their property again without much in the way of restriction is about 25 feet from the pipeline. If we look at the process of pipeline construction, we have to grade away and clear the pad. We have to string out the pipe, connect it up, do a bunch of welding, lay it in, then we have to start backfilling it, and then we have to start restoring with things. But we're going to have a swath of open land. If it was a woodland, it's not going to be restored to a woodland necessarily. Well, along the pathways, they've got to get there, and they've got to be able to inspect. And also, things like roots of larger plants are kind of an enemy of this whole thing. They attack and move around pipelines, and they, can sometimes add some acids in the ground in the area. Clearing the right-of-way, opens it up with a bulldozer. This doesn't show much in the way of silt fences and erosion control, but the runoff from something like this, if we get one of our gully washer storms, particularly on a slope, is something to be an issue to be concerned about. Is that going to run into your wetlands? Is that going to run into your streams? How's that going to affect fisheries and such? The pipe's going to be laid out. This is a steel pipe project here. The pipe comes in usually about 40-foot lengths, coated in the factory, a fusion bonded coating, but bare ends because they got to weld the ends. And the ends, they're not only bare, but they're beveled. Because you have to, when we do welds, you can't pipe this thick. You can't just put two flat pieces together. It's got to be beveled to be able to do the welding. This is, I believe, a bending machine here when they're going through, because these pipes come in straight pieces, and you got to go around up and down hills and around corners. They have to put gentle bends in them. For things up to about 24 inches, they kind of bend them out on site. For things, again, when you start looking at the 3-foot diameter pipe, they often are factory bent. And because your concerns with bending a pipe now is, I've got a coating on here, and if I bend it, how does that affect the coating, and do I have to repair it? Trench excavation, like I said, you can look at things with a typical backhoe. This is one in the soil that stands up pretty capably. It's not something where you want somebody to go down in a hole like that. But generally, for the pipelines, we're talking about things where the bottom of the trench is probably 6-7 foot deep. It might be sloped back a little bit. The bottom of the trench is about 5 foot wide. The top could be, 7 or 8 foot wide or more, depending on whether the soil is sandy soil or more clayey. More clayey soil tends to stand up short term a little better. Then they lay the pipe into the ground after it's been pulled together. As you see the coating, they've welded it. What they've done here is, instead of trying to weld all the sections together in the trench, they will weld 2 or 3 sections together up on the surface where they can get at it with more ease and get around. Because the easier it is to get around the pipe to weld it, the better the quality control on the welds. They do welds by hand, but they also have a lot of machines that do welds now. Now, it's interesting. Using a welding machine, mechanized welding, doesn't allow you to get rid of the certified welder. You still have to have a certified welder operating those things to know what they're doing. Backfilling. This is a nice benign soil. You look at it, you got a few things that are larger here. Usually what they do is they screen it as it comes off, and within the proximity of the pipe, they try to put a bedding down under the pipe. That's a finer material. And they try to put around and above the pipe to about at least a half a diameter above the pipe of a finer material. Then restoration. Restoration, they're trying to clear up things, grade things off, plant it. So in the pipeline construction, we went through some of this already. And when you weld that, we have those uncoated ends that are welded. They have to do field coatings of that. Now, anytime you deal with something, a factory coating is usually superior to the field coating. But they're out there and they have to field coat things to protect it. They usually put on thicker coatings. And also when they do field coatings, they not only do the ends that they weld, but someone has to go along the pipe and see if they got any dings in it, holidays, scratches that are sufficiently deep that they expose bare pipe that they need to apply a dab of the coating material. Said QA/QC is an important part of this to get long-term performance of the pipe. And not only do they do inspections, but once the pipe is put in place, before it's put into service, it's got to be hydrostatically tested. Tests are usually go to about 50% more than the maximum pressure the pipe is expected to take. And what they do is they fill the pipe with water, and then they apply a pressure. You say, why water? We're putting gas into it. Well, if I put just air and pressurize the air, and I have a leak, the air is so compliant that I can have a significant leak and I don't see much of a change in pressure because it's a real soft spring. Water is essentially incompressible, and when I apply a pressure to that, a leak shows up much more quickly. And these hydrostatic tests are something where they keep a pressure on the section of pipe for 8 hours at this 50% more than the design pressure, and they've got requirements in how much of a drop that they can have in that 8-hour period that's acceptable. When you look at a pipe like this, you say, okay, what's going to cause pipe? Well, if I pressurize the inside of the pipe, immediately I get somewhat of a pressure drop because I pressurize the inside of the pipe and the pipe expands a little bit. But then after that, it should be relatively stable and not be creeping and continuing to expand. And any pressure losses that you have start to point to leaks. But a little change in temperature of the fluids and things can also cause changes in pressure. So it's something that takes a fair amount of experience to monitor and tell what's happening. In looking at anything with a pipeline, you really want in your specifications to have work plans and submittals that are very important. You want the contract, even though you might have specified out in the specifications what the contractor was going to do, you want him to tell you what he is going to do to make sure that you're both on the same page. Okay, here you've got coated pipe arriving at the site, uncoated ends. You can see these, they put some bumpers around them to try to keep them from, even though they're stacked one on top of the other, to keep them from abrading one against one another. Mechanized welding, hand welding, the guy working upside down. And then this is another mechanized welder. You can see here they've got several of them working to try to get as much pipe together as they can. Again, working on it, this guy's like on his second pass. And this is not something that takes minutes. This is something that takes hours to join pieces of pipe because it's not just one pass. You might have 3 and 4 passes of the welds depending on how thick the pipe is. Then they go back and they've got to recoat the areas that they welded, or they're going and doing spot checks. Let's look at methods that can go under areas with less disturbance. We're going to look at some trenchless methods, and we want to look at ways of crossing water. There's trenched and trenchless approaches, but today the preferred option is usually to go with a trenchless approach. This is a microtunneling machine, a boring head. They can be ranging from 24 inches to 60 inches or 72 inches or more in diameter. Put pipe down and behind it here and push it in. This is a fairly short pit. Usually, again, with gas line and things like that, you're probably going to want a pit that's 40 foot long to take 40-foot sections of pipe because it's more efficient of putting things in. And these tend to go more or less horizontally. You could go maybe down a little grade and up a little grade. They've got corrections to steer, but you can get under rivers, you can get under various types of areas. But one of the things that's kind of the cardinal thing with these machines is they're really good in one type of material. If you have 2 very dissimilar materials, or again with some of the materials we have here in northwestern Massachusetts, that has a lot of cobbles and boulders in it, they're real headaches for these machines. So usually when we try to site locations to use these, we either try to figure out where the top of rock is, and we either want to be down in the rock or we want to be up above it. And then we also try to look at it and say, are there a lot of cobbles and boulders in the layer? And if they are, we try to avoid some of those zones. So it puts some premium on doing some kind of geologic investigations. The method that's more often used is called horizontal directional drilling. And what we do is we drill from one side to the other. And then when we get to the other side, we pull in an enlarger back. And then after we pull in enlarger back, we pull the pipe through. Well, this initial string that they go through is usually for something like going under the Connecticut River with a 36-inch pipe. We're probably going to have what's called a maxi machine. It'll have about 1.5 million pounds of thrust and pullback, and the drill steel on it will be about between 6 and 9 inches in diameter. It's a pilot hole, so it'll be someplace between 6 and 10 inches in diameter. To enlarge it, depending on the materials, we enlarge in successive passes. There'll be increasing passes until we get to a sufficient diameter to take in the pipe. And a sufficient diameter taking a 36-inch pipe is actually something that's getting close to 4 feet or more in diameter, the hole. Because you're trying to pull this pipe down through and around, and one of the things that happens when you got a steel pipe, the rule of thumb is the pipe can have a radius of curvature about 1 foot for every 100 feet for every inch in diameter the pipe is. So a 36-inch diameter pipe, the minimum radius of curvature you want to bring the pipe around is about 3,600 feet. So you have to design these crossings to accommodate that. If you start getting much short, well, if you start getting shorter than that, you start having problems with, again, overstressing the pipe, causing problems with perhaps cracking coatings. Key things are, if we're going under, we can avoid the wetlands either side of the river or the swamp. But we're going under, and one of the key things is, what's this distance going to be here? When drilling this out, we're drilling with slurries under pressure to take away cuttings, and you want nominally 15 or minimum 20 feet, 15 to 20 feet of clearance between the bottom of your river and the drill path that you're going. And I usually, also look at it in terms of what do I think the soils are. If I think the soils are really, pretty dense materials, the 15 feet, 20 feet feels good. If I think it's a lot of open work cobbles and things like that, I sometimes want to go deeper. Or if I think it's a really soft, silty material, I sometimes want to go deeper. Because what happens if this is a little too shallow, we might have material coming to the surface in the wetlands. Now, these slurries, it's going to be, most of them what they use is bentonite and gargum. Bentonite is a clay material. So in terms of causing contamination, it's not bad, but bentonite doesn't settle very readily in water and can sometimes have an adverse impact on fish life and things like that, because it's so fine and gets in the gill. So we do a lot of work to try to do avoid inadvertent releases. And going under rivers, what we try to do is we try to have means available to us to detect when we see something, and that's usually a gray cloud. And then we have silt curtains and things to go around it temporarily, stop drilling so we're not adding fuel to the fire, so to speak. And then there's various ways of, putting containment layers over it.
In relation to the underground drilling in regards to the rivers, in Shelburne, there is one spot in particular, one of the more pristine areas near and on, the Deerfield River in Shelburne, that you'll be going under. Even though it's a short route, you're going to have to come under the river there to get up to where you're going to be going if it ends up coming. Well, I'm just curious in regards to your success ratio in relation to that type of a procedure. I mean, it seems relatively complicated to me. When you explained it, it seemed simpler than what I was originally thinking. And when you talk about this gray cloud, that concerns me. So I'm just anxious to know what's your success ratio in regards to that procedure.
In my project, I haven't had any problems per se, except one wetlands, and that's where it was actually a short, small diameter pipe that somebody, and it wasn't a gas pipe, it was an electric line, that they didn't do. We wanted to go deeper, and they didn't do borings deep enough, and we couldn't. So they tried to only go about 12 or 15 feet deep, and we had a bunch of cobbles and boulders, and we had some things come up. But on the larger ones have gone under the Hudson River, something, I think between 28 and 30 inches in diameter, 3,000 foot long and work successfully. And a number of other ones, like the ones under the Pemigewasset River up in Plymouth. Those were shorter. Those were only about 1,000 feet, but those were going through glacial till type profiles like we have, and we didn't have any problems. I mean, in looking at this, I'm consistently fighting with designers and the overall pipeline designers to say, let's go deeper, because I want to sleep at night and things, and want to know what I'm going to hit. But one of the things you keep in mind with something with this radius of curvature, one of the nice things is you're probably, to go under 1,000 feet of river, you might end up having to be close to 1,000 feet, start 1,000 feet to the left of the river and come out 1,000 feet to the right. And so one of the nicer things about that is you avoid most of the wetlands and things ideally. Now the problem again with western Massachusetts is if you're coming, it's harder to do this when you're coming down hills on either side, getting a slope that's steep enough to go under and bend the pipe. So it takes some thinking, but that's where sometimes I've gone, like for particularly going under roads and short, even river crossings. We've done things like we use the microtunneling, we just dig a shaft down, and so we can go straight, and then we only have a shorter distance to go, but we can make sure that we're the distance we want to be under the river so that we don't have breakouts. And, we go through a fair amount of trying to look at what's the capacity of the soil to resist the pressures that we have, and we work with the contractors not to overpressurize things. They can go with lesser pressures by, one of the things is they add various polymers to the drilling muds to make them better able to carry the stuff away at lower pressures, the cuttings and such. So I think by and large it's pretty good. It's usually when people try to cut it too close, and that's the thing that I definitely look at, and saying, if I want to start at 25 feet below the bottom of anything, and then work from there, whereas you see some of the literature, they'll say they can do it at 15 feet, or somebody says, well, the only depth of cover they need is 5 feet underneath that because that's all it's going to drag. Now, an interesting thing with like the Deerfield River is it may not be the current bottom of the river you're worried about. You may be worried about during spring floods and stuff, the scour that occurs and how much that's going to degrade the river down. And that's usually something that you have to do on these high velocity rivers. That's actually more important in some ways than getting under the current bottom.
I'm sorry we didn't get to see the rest of your proposal. I guess maybe I missed something, but first can you just clarify, are you actually involved with doing the engineering on the pipeline, or are you just speaking generally?
No, I'm just speaking generally.
I'd be very interested in hearing your professional assessment. We live in Northfield, and there's going to be, the compressor station is proposed possibly less than 3/4 of a mile from our house, right uphill in an extremely rugged, rocky, difficult piece of terrain. I'd like to hear something. You didn't get a chance to speak about the compressor stations at all. What's involved with siting them? What are the issues?
Okay, compressor stations are put in there to up the pressure in the pipe periodically, and actually what they do is also they recondition the gas, sometimes filtering it, sometimes drying it. And you think about it, it's going to be sounding like a poor way to put it, but you're going to be living next to an airport. These things are basically 10,000 or 15,000 horsepower.
This is going to be 70 or 80,000. It's going to be a total of
no,
three different.
Yeah. What they'll be about 10 to 15,000 horsepower each, but there may be as many as 10 or 15 of them, depending on what they've got to do.
The proposal here, from what we've heard, was for 3, natural gas turbine fired, 25.
And that becomes, there's 3 different types of engines that they can have, and what you need to look at also is like what are Massachusetts sound restrictions, what your community sound restrictions are, because there are decibels that they're allowed to have at the border of the property that they own. These things are probably going to be in the order of 20 acres, 10 to 20 acres that they site the things on in the center to get the margins out far enough that things are down to a palatable level. But there's also some that if you're using an electrical compressor versus a gas one, the electrical ones tend to be quieter. If you can get a reliable source of electric power, which I guess thinking in Northfield, I tend to think that there's a fair amount
The gas
of electric power.
turbine runs a generator, and then the motors are electrical, as opposed to having like natural gas-fired engines.
Oh, no. I'm not saying that the gas, I'm saying you import electricity from an outside supplier, like, who is our power company now?
The hydroelectric facility.
Yeah, it used to be Western. Yeah, so that might be the sort of thing to see, what are the more quiet engines, and then, what kind of sound suppression.
Would they actually consider putting in, to tap into the distribution lines that run right near the site?
They may try to get a power, they may try to get something from the power company, but again, depends on what their economics are and whether they think it's cheaper to use their own gas versus buying from somebody.
I'm Sally Pick from the Montague Energy Committee. Just a follow-up question. I know that distribution gas pipelines have had an increasingly been in the news and been studied for having leaks. One of my questions is, I know that transmission lines are potentially more rugged, but how, I know that you mentioned that there was, that FERC requires maintenance and inspection, and the state will also do the same. I'm wondering if there would be, if it would be advisable, if given these things are going to possibly going to be lasting, the transmission lines will be lasting 50 to 75 years, is it advisable to work into your community benefit agreement some kind of monitoring, inspection, maintenance kind of schedule?
I'm going to try to give a fast answer so we can get through as many questions as possible. Take a look at some of the FERC certificates. You will see very extensive conditions addressing those kinds of issues, and transmission pipelines, and I'm sure Marco will agree with me, and older distribution lines are night and day.
Yeah, there's an interesting report done for leakage in Massachusetts gas pipelines you can get online that kind of points to where the sources come in. They point to newer lines, or newer transmission lines are better than anything else, for lack of, better coatings and better quality.
Hi, my name's David Keith, and I'm here tonight as a representative of the Old Deerfield Fire Department, so I'm going to ask more safety questions. As I look at records of past pipeline explosions, including trunk lines, one of the main issues was how long it took to shut it off. How many check valves and shut-off systems are typical, and how many should we want?
They're typically probably 7 to 20 miles apart.
Yeah.
The valves. So you've got that.
How much gas is that?
Well, it's a fair amount depending on the pressure.
It's a lot of gas.
Yeah.
Now, Tennessee Gas or Kinder Morgan is actually applying right now in Kentucky to change the use of a pipeline. So propane isn't out of the question eventually, is it?
Pardon?
They're changing the use of a natural gas pipeline, or they're applying to, from natural gas, where the methane goes up, to propane, where it doesn't. So we don't know what we're getting,
It's not going to be permitted for that use, but that isn't to say what can happen. I'm not familiar with the specifics of what you're referring to.
Well, it can happen. It is happening right now.
I'm not disagreeing with you.
My question is more of a legal question. So as we're talking about hosting agreements, we obviously live in a low-density population area. Has there ever been a history of any of these gas companies negotiating any of the installation quality in terms of pipe thickness, welding, or whatever? Has that ever been a negotiable point, or are we really is that just off the charts?
I'll answer generally in that in some circumstances, it's obviously there's a cost issue from the perspective of the proponent, but if there are safety issues or if there are issues specific to a particular area, I have seen some enhancements, but it's hard for me to say specifically, and Marco knows tremendously from a construction perspective how far a pipeline proponent has gone in terms of going above and beyond what is required. I mean, the FERC staff pushes them in terms of basic environmental conditions, but if you're looking for state-of-the-art construction in an area that doesn't have any special environmental issues, I'm not aware of a pipeline proponent voluntarily doing that. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think you have.
Marco,
unfortunately, I think you have answered the question. Yes.
One of the things I wanted to mention, though, is if you have something where you have a good idea that you're going to have future development coming through this area, they would be interested in that because, again, if the population density in an area increases, or, like I said, in some of these areas that are conservation areas where you have people congregating parks, they get pushed up into the higher levels. So that.
Can I just ask a follow-up
but I'm
question?
saying even parks that have larger gatherings of people, and it doesn't have to be, thousands of people, but it doesn't have to be for, 2/3 of the year. But they have certain things that you can look at that you might use to your advantage in discussing that.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up question? Can you give an estimate of what the added cost is for going to a higher grade pipe like they install in urban areas? Is it 10% more, 20% more?
Well, I mean, like I said, the pipe is about 75% thicker, and the way, basically it goes by weight of steel. So if you get 75% more steel, you're going to pay 75% more for the pipe material itself. But the cost of the trench is the same. The cost of the backfilling.
So what overall does that bump it up?
My guess might be, you're talking about something probably in the range of 20 and 30%
more.
More to go from the very rural to the high end.
Thank you.
Hi, I'd like a question answered about hydrostatic testing. You said you have to pump 8 hours worth of water through the pipe, and they have to do that through every single section, correct?
Yes.
And so what distance of section of pipe do they do that through? Like they test 100 feet at a time, or what?
No, probably more on the order of 1,000.
1,000 feet at a time.
But
so you have 1,000 feet of pipe, and you have 8 hours of water going through that pipe.
No, it's not 8 hours of water throwing. In that 1,000 feet of pipe, they block off the ends.
Yeah.
And they fill it with water.
Yeah.
And they just pump up the pressure and hold it there. So water's not flowing, and it's just pumped up and held there, and they're monitoring what the pressure changes are.
Okay. Because I've seen videos of it, and then they just release that water under pressure into the air, correct?
Well, they can do it, but what they really want to do is, because you can't just release it onto the ground and things like that, because you've got to, if it's going to go into a water body, it's going to cause erosion and things like that. So usually what they do is they go from one pipe to the next section of pipe that they want to do it. They keep using the same water over and over again, because water costs money for them, and management and disposal of that water costs money for them.
And I've heard they put biocide in it.
Yeah, they basically it's like. So
how do they get the water out and into the next section? They don't just release it into the air?
If you see something released in the air, it's just that a little geyser from the original pressurization. But see, again, the whole reason you're using water is you don't have much of a compression spring in there to force a lot of water out. So it's a small amount. The biocide is more like what you have in any closed system that you want to keep fungus from growing and things like that on the inside.
And where do you get the water from?
That's the $1,000 question in many cases. If they would love to take it, and pick it up from a river, but they'll have to get a permit for that. They can buy it from a source to fill, but usually they're not going to want to buy from a water supply themselves. That's why they use the biocides, but they're picking up.
This is a legal question. I'm Ariel from Montague. In terms of these host community agreements or community benefit agreements, what you discussed, what I'd like to know is, what is the track record of these agreements when something goes wrong at any point in the construction or the operation of a pipeline on the ground, a real actual problem? What's the track record? Do these contracts mean that the pipeline company just says, right, we have a contract, we're going to deal with this, exactly as promised? Or does the community need to go to court to enforce that piece of the contract? What happens?
That's a great question. And in our agreements, we try to put enforcement provisions. I'm not saying, and I'm telling you as a general matter, we look for a fee shifting provision so that if you prevail, if the town is enforcing it and demonstrates that the counterparty didn't live up to its bargain, that the fees and costs of going to court get recovered. I mean, that's part of the question. So sometimes I always tell people on any kind of agreement, as a lawyer, the best agreements are ones you never have to look at again because everybody abides by it. But that doesn't always happen. You also want to put in your agreements, if you can, some process to stop work so that if there are problems in the construction process, that you can very quickly, some towns ask for a clerk of the works or an independent inspector, in this case be someone like Marco who knows the process inside out, who can bird dog that and come in if there's a concern. So it really varies, but those are all important issues to address.
You're saying, though, that it's basically enforcement through the courts. It's really not like there's someone at the pipeline company or someone at FERC that just enforces once there's a contract.
Courts, as a lawyer, I think Rebecca and I would both say, courts are the last place you want to go. Okay. So you want to have a public works person for the town, or you want to have a designated person for the pipeline and for the town who will try to work things out. I'm a great advocate of alternative dispute resolution because a court process is slow and cumbersome and costly. So you want to build in a process where someone can pick up the phone. And I have seen instances where the relationship is really quite good and people are very cooperative, and the contractors will listen when they're told that they're not abiding by the terms of an agreement, or they're not being as sensitive as they should be with respect to a concern that's addressed.
I'm also asking post-construction. You have a public safety problem. You have an explosion. Do you have an example of a host community agreement that's really protected a town somewhere under those circumstances?
I can't address, perhaps Marco can, in case of a catastrophic accident, but I can say that there are safety procedures that are going to be adopted as part of any certificate, and they can be enhanced by agreement. But I can't tell you that I can't point to an agreement that in the case of in the instance of a terrible accident, that the agreement somehow provided some significant protection. It deals with construction, it deals with monitoring, it deals with environmental and economic concerns.
I mean, the one enforcement thing that FERC does is they have requirements for inspections, monitoring, and even the state pipeline agency has requirements for periodic inspections and monitoring and the types of things they got to monitor for. Again, nobody wants a problem, but the thing is, how do you deal with something? And usually they also have to have response plans. And in those response plans, they usually have to have people trained to respond to things ranging from minor to horrific accidents and such, and they have to have either some kind of agreement with the host community, or they have to have outside people contracted to keep up to date on how to respond to those conditions.
I have a broader question about the host community agreements. I understand that a community is not endorsing the pipeline by entering into one, but what is in it for Kinder Morgan to enter into one of these agreements? I mean, what is the consideration that they receive?
From their perspective, and I can't tell you what their attitude is going to be with respect to this particular project, though I have in the past negotiated certain agreements with Tennessee, but years ago. But from their perspective, going to FERC and saying, we think as part of our planning and environmental permitting process, we've gone through a very rigorous review collaboratively with the community, which is something that's encouraged, and we've identified those conditions. And so at the end of the day, it's a plus from FERC's perspective. It also can shorten the process because at least the environmental issues are out on the table and there's a process for addressing them as opposed to having a contentious process. I mean, I'm an advocate as an environmental lawyer of environmental mediation. That doesn't mean if you're dead set against a project that environmental mediation is the way you want to go. But if you view something that it may happen anyhow or that there may be an acceptable way, and I'm not expressing any opinion here, then putting all those issues out on the table, having a collaborative process can produce compromises that in the long run are viewed as a win-win to some extent. Did I answer your question? I mean, it's not
yes.
a perfect answer.
Yes, you did. And just a small follow-up, someone had asked about the timing. Would you say after, given how little information they still have, would you say it would be after the application goes in and that towns would be negotiating these agreements, or you think they should be doing it now?
Well, I've had experiences where things happen at the 11th hour, but as a general matter, beginning the process of discussion earlier is better, but not so early that you don't even understand, the specific concerns in your community.
Okay, one-word answer. Toxicity. Are there any issues with the gases used for fracking, the chemicals used for fracking appearing in the gas and leaking out?
Not likely. These things are scrubbed really well.
Okay, inspections. Who does it? Is it self-inspection by the gas, or is there federal agencies that continually monitor and inspect during the building and after?
It's done by the gas company, and they have to turn in reports to FERC. Is the way it goes. FERC doesn't usually go out there and inspect.
The Energy Facility Siting Board will be interested in these issues as well. Okay. I'm sure they'll offer.
Any plans around decommissioning? When they met at our town meeting, they were clueless when we talked about decommissioning after its usage.
I would say they usually don't, because they intend to try to use this thing forever as far as they're concerned.
Okay, and last question, invasive plants. Are there any plans in general for after they clear land to prevent invasive plants coming in, which basically destroy the ecosystem and can affect fragile balances?
I would say that's in the restoration plans. Those are the things that you want to get clarified, what they can put in as vegetation, and it's got to be compatible with the natural vegetation of the area. We look at wells, and one of the things I want to say related to wells, you have a well within a couple hundred feet of the pipelines, we should be looking to have the wells tested before and after.
How long does that process go for, the testing? Because if things, the way gravel is and the way land lies and water flows, something might not come up for years.
Well, then maybe you can ask for some periodic testing. I know from the perspective of working even for owners on this stuff, I really encourage them to get wells tested, because there are certain things that nobody notices anything that's gone wrong with their property until they have a reason to look. And then you get a real fuzzy area whether there's some things that just don't make sense. And so you're just better off having the facts of, was there something there before, and did something show up later?
And who does, you're saying a private landowner should pay for this?
No,
or you're
no,
saying...
I'm saying that that would be one of the things I would try to work into agreements of things. And actually, I believe some of the FERC requirements have testing for wells within a couple hundred feet.
Private and public.
Yeah.
So there is no minimum distance?
Oh, minimum distance, you can't have anything within, you know, I mean, if you're looking at the horizontal directional drilling, I would say if you're more than 50 feet away, you don't have a problem, because you're probably not down as deep as the water source areas. And again, it's easier for this stuff to come up to the surface than it is to travel laterally in the ground.
Is there a potential hazard of radon being released by the drilling through, say, granite?
Not any more than pulling your water out of the ground.
Okay.
I mean, it's the radon is is something that's exists there, and you're not really releasing it. By just taking your water out of the ground, you're actually releasing the radon. But doing these other things, you're not. You know, by drilling and putting a little bit, it's usually reduction of pressure causes the radon to come out of solution and bubble into the air.
The vibration of the drilling, is there any seismic testing on, say, foundations that are built on ledge close by?
Drilling for the horizontal drilling?
Yeah, what's the vibration?
It's
decibels?
It's very, very small. It's on the order, within about 20 feet away from the drilling, on the order of what's called 0.1 inches per second or less vibration. Damage levels associated with damage to a house are typically in the range of 1.5 to 2 inches, or 1/2 to 2 inches, depending on your house, and these are much lower than that. Now, blasting's a different.
Can I ask a follow-up question on water and blasting? So they're recommending 300 feet for testing of private water wells before and after construction. But if there's blasting, does that increase? So the County of New York recently tried to pass an ordinance requiring like a mile radius. And I just was wondering what your opinion was.
It's blasting. The effects of fracturing due to blasting is about 25 to 50 diameters of the blast hole. These are typically 3-inch diameter blast holes. So you get something that's 25 diameters. That's 25 times 3. I mean, yeah, 25 times 3. You know, you're talking about tens of feet is the fracture, or the fracturing goes. Now, one of the things that you do see that sometimes happens when you blast is you get a pressure pulse. You don't get water moving and stuff, but you get a pressure here, and then you'll see a well several hundred feet away, perhaps rise up a few inches and then drop back down if you have a pressure sensing device in it. But that doesn't mean the water is transmitted, it's just the pressure pulse is transmitted.
This.
2 questions. One concerns the right-of-way. You indicated that the final right-of-way would be 50 feet, and the construction right-of-way would be a total of 100. Now, if that's going through a wooded area, it would seem to me that you're losing 100 feet of trees. And what's going to be maintained in the end?
That's
the 50 feet or the 100 feet?
They're going to be maintaining the 50 feet. But here becomes one of the questions in terms of, you know, negotiating things out, is going through wetlands. They sometimes will agree to go with narrower right-of-ways, a little bit more cumbersome process. Perhaps during certain types of wooded lands, they might be willing to do the same thing. Or, say the restoration, one of the things that is to work with them on the restoration is to try to advocate for restoration with native trees. But they're really only they really only have rights to the 50 foot to do any maintenance or anything like that.
Now, one more legal one. In one of your slides, you indicated that there was something called private landowner protections, and it would seem to me that there are none. Once FERC gives a certificate, an individual, has basically no rights at that point.
I don't think that's true, but it's also addressed in the easement agreements. And that is something, and some pipeline companies want to give the most minimal easement agreements they can that gives them rights even to try to expand a right-of-way in the future. But that is a subject for negotiating, and generally I advocate to communities and individuals who ask us to try to get really state-of-the-art easement agreements that do provide greater rights and controls.
But in the end, they're going to build the pipeline where they want to.
If they get a certificate and the certificate allows them to do that, that's true. But if they don't get a certificate, and if you ask for reasonable protections, and if there are a great number of communities and individuals who are asking for them, as well as being backed up by not just their own towns, but state agencies, that is something FERC does pay some attention to. I don't want to overstate it, but it's not something that they'll absolutely slough off and pay no attention to. I mean, this is a very difficult, involved process. There's no doubt about it. And I've heard a tremendous number of great questions, and I appreciate these concerns because I haven't worked on we haven't worked on many pipeline cases recently, but I started doing it a long time ago, and I really appreciate the concerns with a project of this size. And the best advice I can give is to speak not only as individuals but through communities and regional entities, and get involved as soon as you can, particularly as Kinder Morgan pushes forward to filing its formal application this fall. I know there's some who are, going to look at any strategy they can to try to prevent the pipeline from happening, and that's in a decision for a town or an individual to do so. But this company has invested so much, they're not going to pull out tomorrow.
I think one of the things to keep in mind with looking at some of this is that a fairly powerful voice in this is sometimes your state and federal representatives. I was involved in some other ones where they played a major role in deciding whether the system was going to occur or not. So,
last question.
Okay. Wow. So, sort of, it's another duel. The co-location with power lines, you mentioned that was a problem in terms of corrosion. So that's question one. The other has to do with landowners negotiating easements when there's already existing easements with the power company.
Do you want to answer the first part of that?
Yeah, I mentioned co-location is not great, like high tension lines in a steel pipeline, because you get a galvanic cell with stray currents in the ground that enhance corrosion. So if you could, you'd like to be away from it. Even as the owner of the pipeline, you'd probably feel more comfortable.
How far away?
I would say several hundred, if not 1,000 feet away.
Okay, good to know. But they're saying they're going to be.
Well, but see, when they go right under, well, if they have to go right under something, then what you have to do is you have to go in and you're looking for enhanced inspection, enhanced corrosion protection, and enhanced inspection procedures and frequency.
They're talking 150 feet away from the existing power line. Right.
That seems close to me, but.
So you're saying that they are seeking easements within areas that are already the subject of existing transmission line easements. Traditionally, utilities and railroads, by the way, and I've run into it, hated allowing anybody else within their easement area. And they actually forced resiting and relocating of because they just wouldn't give it. So I can't really tell you the extent to which they're going to cooperate or attempt to prevent it from happening. But if you're a landowner and you've already got an easement for a overhead electric line, the decision making isn't in the first instance yours. You've got to look at that existing easement agreement. But on the other hand, that existing easement agreement may not may not allow the utility to use it for non-transmission line purposes. So I take a hard look at it.
It's a pretty quick one. It's about Article 97. You said something I had not heard before,
right.
Which is that not just each of the chambers of the legislature, but also 2/3 of the municipality. If it's
it depends on who holds.
Okay.
Some Article 97 lands are in the care and custody of a conservation commission. Depends.
Right,
So
but
some are purely a question at the state legislative level, but some require local votes as well.
So if it is municipal land,
You'd have to look. It runs all over the place. I couldn't say all municipal land will require a local vote. Some of them do, though.
That hasn't been addressed here at all, but I read the resource report, and the town of Plainfield is going to have 3 hazardous waste locations, according to Kinder Morgan,
That are affected.
in their town. So could you please tell me what kind of hazardous waste they're planning to put in Plainfield and why they have 3 locations in one town and they're not spread out more over other towns?
I'm kind of confused by that because you sure it's not 3 existing hazardous waste locations that they're going to be impacting with their pipeline?
I'm not really sure about that, but are they planning to use those locations? Why do they have those locations in their maps and in their resource report? And what sort of hazardous waste would they be putting in the towns? And is bentonite a carcinogen?
No. Bentonite is actually sometimes put in candy. It's getting as sometimes a health supplement.
Anyone want an Altoid?
I think the hazardous material sites located in the resource reports were to identify areas where there might be problematic soils that they would have to carefully dispose
For
of.
For
existing conditions. So that might be it. You might
Or they
want to
try
take
to avoid them.
So in an existing brownfield site, they need to be very
pipeline
careful.
companies do have staging areas in connection with their construction and temporary easements, but I'm not aware of creation of permanent hazardous waste landfills or other areas that are proposed as part of the
That's
process.
not likely to create one.
So our thanks to everyone for coming. Our thanks to the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission for getting the grant that gave the speakers. We, the Franklin Regional Council of Governments, will continue to try to give as much information to all of you that we can, help in any way that we can. Thank you. Have a great night.